All right, let's talk second stage Lensmen. So, I mean, it is to a certain degree, and at first glance, it does seem a lot like more of the same from Doc Smith here. We've got our usual action, our intrigue, our kind of, top level grand strategy, which there's not a lot of detail, but there's big battles in space. We've got disguises, we've got our larger than life characters. But if you actually read this book, you'll find some interesting things that haven't really been covered, at least not to this detail in the earlier books. For instance, we get a couple of really good and interesting kind of extended looks at the enemy and its operation, more so than we've gotten in previous books, I would say. We get our first female lensman, and possibly only female lensman. And that was what was said in the earlier book, but we'll have to see how it goes in the next book. We've got more details about the space battles going on. For instance, we now have Doc Smith has now defined a variety of different classes of ships to go into these space battles, and now each of them has like a very specific role and kind of like a very specific method by which it engages in battle. For instance, there's the front line of scouts that just kind of go in and dodge out of the way before they even do any fighting. We have heavy cruisers to do individual dogfights. Now, instead of kind of like a bunch of big balls with guns bristling on them and shields, kind of just shooting randomly in all directions, we now actually have a little bit more method to the madness of space battles in this story, and I of course appreciate that. We get a brief mention, but we do get a mention of Edor, which it has kind of been missing in the previous books, where we got a lot of it in the first book, which remember was kind of written after all the rest of them, except for the second. Well, the first and second books were written after the rest of the Lensman books, and the first book, all the Edor stuff was added in as like flavor text in the beginning for the most part, and as references to certain characters throughout the rest of the story. But the name at least was there. In the second book, we didn't get much of Edor either, and then in the actual books before this that were written before this, there's not much Edor in them either. We've always had Boscone, but we actually do get one character in this story saying, who from Edor sent you, or you've been to Edor, or something like that. Anyway, one quick note is that based on the ending of the previous book, I kind of assumed that second stage Lensmen referred to like their descendants, because then we've got children of Lensmen next, and I was like, well, maybe we'll have like one group of like one generation here as second stage, and then the next generation is children of the Lensmen. But it turns out that the second stage doesn't refer to descendants. It refers to the Lensmen who have gone back to Eresia to receive additional training from the Eresians. And we saw Kim Kinnison kind of do that in, I believe it was the previous book. And now more Lensmen are going back to get additional training, to get those additional abilities that were so useful for Kim in the previous book. So at the end of the previous book, I was like, well, good. Kim and Chris finally can kind of, do their thing, and we'll get descendants, a new generation of younger Lensmen. But in fact, the book starts this way. It's like they're like, oh yeah, let's go get married, and then we can kind of live happily ever after. And basically, right before they start the planning of the actual wedding, the Eresian mentor of Kim is like, no, stop. You still have work to do. It turns out that the enemies that they took out at the end of the previous book were not only were they not the top, but their defeat set their superiors into motion on a plan to attack Earth. And so Kim Kinnison gets back to work. Step 1, stop the attack on Earth. Step 2, tracking a zwilnik leader to a strange all-women planet that does not go the way that you might expect it to. Then there's a lot of following leads, 2 more disguises for Kim to adopt, including one that's really interesting because it makes him basically work his way to the top of an enemy organization. And so we get to see there, for instance, how hard it is for the bad guys in this universe to organize, and yet at the same time, how kind of the ruthlessness of their system makes sure that only the best get to positions of power. And it's a very interesting kind of thing there. We get some great lines in this book. I just want to read a couple of excerpts because I thought they were like really solid bits of prose. For instance, Doc Smith is describing an expert pilot landing a super dreadnought under very difficult circumstances. Quote, "Not music? The bellowing, crescendo thunders of those jets were music to the hard-boiled space hounds who heard them," right? We have a description of one of the terrifying Lyranian women on the all-women planet. Quote, "This girl was just about as safe to play with as 5 feet 11 of coiled Bushmaster, and twice as deadly." We have some more of Smith's fun, tradecraft references, right? In the sense of him being a chemical scientist. He makes, last time we saw him talking about bus bars and coaxial cables and stuff like that. And I kind of went on about like how skin depth works for a conductor and how he integrated that into the design of things in his story. In this one, there's not too much of that, but there is one really funny line about someone saying, "Man, he'd be happier to deal with 3 kilograms of dry nitrogen iodide rather than the situation he was currently in." And so what I'll do is I went and looked this up. Nitrogen iodide is a very, very intense contact explosive. I'll link to a video that I went and watched to kind of show me, and it'll show you what the explosion of nitrogen iodide looks like, and you'll kind of get the feeling of what 3 kilograms of that would do. What else have we got? So one of the things that I've criticized about these stories, and that I continue to criticize, is that the arms race kind of continues with counter this, 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 and we have some more of that in this story. In the previous story, we saw a lot of like thought screens where people would have a device that would prevent Lensmen from kind of poking at their minds, or anyone with mind powers from poking at their minds. And now we end up with a character in this book that comes up with a counter to the thought screen. It works, right? And the character who comes up with the counter to the thought screen is a really cool character. We'll get to him in a minute. But at the same time, this is one of those things where I feel like it's kind of the laziest example, or the laziest way to do an arms race is a thing, a counter thing, a counter thing, a counter thing. And we've seen that in the previous book, so it's not surprising that it's still going on here. But again, it does it's one of the elements of the story that I don't like that much. Is how that kind of goes. But what we do get are a lot of these larger-than-life characters with really cool interactions with each other. We get more scenes of like the Lensmen working together. And one of the things that is really cool about the way that Smith writes smart people or strong people working together is that there's this sense of like professionalism and respectfulness between them that, even in disagreement, that is something that I think is missing from a lot of current science fiction. There's just not this attention paid to making it so that these characters are, professional in general and also respectful to each other. And so I've got a couple of passages about that too. For instance, when Kimball Kinnis is talking to this new Lensman named Nadrek, again, we'll get to him in more detail in a minute, but like one of the things he says is Nadrek comes up with this idea, and he's got this device, and Kim Kinnison is like, well, they're talking to each other, and Kim says, quote, "But we would like to study it and perhaps copy it if you so allow," to which Nadrek replies, "Gladly," right? We have a case where there's a discussion between a bunch of Lensmen about a particular, strategy, and, quote, "The Regalian was not arguing against Kinnison. He was, as they all knew, helping to subject every facet of the matter to scrutiny." Because one of the points that gets made in this book early on is that we're now in a thinking war, right? That's kind of what happens when Mentor from Eurasia stops Kimball Kinnison and Christine McDougall from getting married. He's like, no, think, you idiot. You did not take out the top, and there is evidence that you did not take out the top, and therefore, that something is coming now, and you don't have time to go off and live happily ever after, right? And so there's a lot of attention paid in this book in particular to showing how even people who are cooperating have to kind of attack each other's ideas in certain ways to kind of figure out whether there's like a hole in their reasoning. It's now a thinking war. And so now the question is, who can think most deeply and most thoroughly about how to solve a problem, as opposed to, let's just gung-ho and go take things out. So, as I said, second stage Lensmen, a lot of our old Lensmen characters return for kind of cameos, but there is one who gets a lot of quote-unquote screen time. His name is Nadrek, and he's the one that comes up with this like drill that can go through thought shields. Now, he's an interesting character because, as opposed to all the rest of the like larger-than-life, very kind of not egotistical, but and not arrogant, but like, with confident, very confident characters, Nadrek of Palain 7 is, by contrast, very self-effacing, and he calls himself cowardly, and he's called cowardly in the book multiple times, although it usually comes with scare quotes, because what he actually is more of like a hyper-perfectionist. And so he tries to do every job with the minimum possible effort and the maximum possible, best possible result. And so he, pulls off some really amazing things in the book, which he is like, oh, I did a very bad job here, for instance, and they're like, well, no, you did an excellent job. You did something that this whole fleet couldn't have done, and he's like, no, this report, I wrote it, but I'm putting my Lensman seal on it, and I want you to never open it, and that's kind of a. It's kind of a one of those things also that authors sometimes do, is that they kind of write themselves into a corner and they're like, well, how did he actually do this? I'm not sure. It's a secret. There's a little bit of that there too, which again, Nadrek is a cool character, but at the same time, he one of his adventures, we don't get to know how it happened or how it went down. All we know are the details is that like he basically took out a whole planet, a heavily defended planet that even the whole grand fleet of civilization couldn't take on, and he basically whittled it down to like a couple of enemy leaders, and then took them out himself, and that's all we could get to know, which is unfortunate because he's kind of a fun character, and the way that he interacts with other characters is kind of fun too, because he's very like, oh, this is kind of the bare minimum thing that I found, and they're like, no, this is exactly what we need. Where did you get this? This is fantastic. And he's like, oh, it's not really anything important. He's a very fun character to read in this book. You know what? I'm not going to reveal it. We get our first and hypothetically, only female Lensman in this book, and I'm not going to say who it is. There have been multiple female characters in these stories, and you can probably guess, but I'm not going to give an answer. So, Another thing that we get, though, that I really like about the way Doc Smith writes, and this is something that was in like Rendezvous with Rama, where it's like a good portrayal of how like actual good scientists work together. It's not just like, oh yes, that makes sense. Oh yes, that's a great idea. Oh yes, no. When you get 10 scientists into a room and you ask them a question, a difficult question, you're going to get not 10, but maybe 8 different answers, right? And this is something that happens in this particular book as well. The whole the conference of scientists get together to talk about something, and the way that it's described, their interaction is they struggled heatedly and with friction, end quote. Which is the way that real science is actually done. You got to ask those hard questions, and it's not just like, oh, we have this simple solution that. You see that a lot in like modern like Star Trek stuff, where like it's like, oh, well, blah 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 with the blah blah blah, and it only takes 3 minutes, kind of thing. Kind of a running gag at this point, but yeah, that's not how actual scientists, good ones, talk to each other. There's also a fun bit where, goodness, where is it? Here it is. where you remember how in the last book there was a mention of like talking in scientific accuracy. Well, we get Cardinge, I think is the way that his name is pronounced. I guess I don't know for sure, but Cardinge is that mathematical scientist, the physicist kind of guy who like is really good at understanding all this hyperspatial stuff. He's talking to Kimball at one point where there's an interesting kind of situation that they all get themselves into, and Kimball gives some orders to his men, and Cardinge, is like, Cardinge kind of scoffs at him, and Kimball's like, what? And Cardinge says, quote, "Your reasoning is fallacious, your phraseology is deplorable. I am correcting you in the admittedly faint hope of teaching you scientific accuracy of thought and of statement." It's beautiful. And like, it's not like it's an incredibly complicated plot or anything like that, but it's just kind of fun, pulpy action as we've come to expect from the Lensman series. And as I said, we get some tastes of some new things that show up in this story. The conclusion, again, I'm not going to spoil it, but the conclusion has kind of a neat twist on the villain origin that I didn't guess. I guessed something else, something more obvious, and I didn't really give it that much thought. But what ended up happening was not what I expected, not exactly, but it may be related to what I thought happened. So that was kind of cool too. And finally, at the end, Kim and Chris finally get to tie the knot. And what I'll note is that this book actually has a solid like chapter and a half of ending or something like that, where we actually get to see some of the aftermath of the final battle between the forces of civilization and the forces against civilization. We get to see some more interactions with Kim and Chris, which are admittedly a little bit goofy by today's standards, but it kind of works. And in the end, it was a fun story to read. I mean, it's good stuff. And if you like pulpy science fiction-y action adventure, and I mean, this is Second Stage Lensman. It's the fifth book in the series. Even if you ignore the first two books, which were written later, or at least compiled later to kind of add a little bit more backstory to the universe, at this point, you've already read Galactic Patrol, you've already read Grey Lensman, and you've already and this is number 3 of that. Or if you've read the earlier two, you've read Triplanetary and First Lensman as well, right? And so you're deep into this at this point. There is no reason to stop reading the Lensman series if you've enjoyed it so far. It is definitely a series. I mean, it's one of those books that come. How do I put this? So far, each of these books has come with like a historical section at the start that kind of gets you up to speed. Kind of like the first 3 seconds, the first 30 seconds of like a Dragon Ball episode. Here's what happened in the last books, right? Here's the big fight that's going on, and this is what we're continuing the story of. And so you could hypothetically start with this book, but at this point, it's not like, I mean, unless you get really lucky and you find a used copy at like a bookstore or something like that, and you just pick it up, you've probably read the other books in the series at this point, and I would say that there's no reason to stop here. Second Stage Lensman is fun. It's got some great lines. It's got some great characters. It's more of what you expect from E.E. Smith, and then more than that. So, I mean, it was fun to read. I'm going to go through Children of the Lens probably next week, because, I may as well finish the series, right? And what else can I say? It's one of those things where it started out kind of rough. There was a lack of details. There was a lot of like counter. In this, there's just the one thing. Everything else is like, well, everything else is not just like a counter of something, but it's like a new development. It's like a new idea. And there are some cool ones in this book that I don't want to spoil. So, I'll just before I give you guys, enough information or accidentally spoil something, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to say, if you like any of the Lensman stuff, you will like this book as well. Again, it has a few minor flaws. It has a fairly simple plot, but it's just a lot of fun to read. A lot of really good larger-than-life characters. A lot of fun planning and plotting and intrigue. and just that usual actiony fun that we come to expect from the series. But yeah, that's where I'll stop. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you know what to do. And that's, I think, all I've got for you guys for today. It's Friday, so assuming I get this uploaded today, have a great weekend, and I will see you all next time. Have a good one.